Nadim and I have agreed that we'll do a little bit each, and then we'll have a broader discussion. What I want to share with you this morning is actually based on a longitudinal study that I conducted with colleagues while I was at Bristol. In fact, I'm not at Bristol now, which is why my email address contact in the programme is in fact at King's College London, which is where I'm associated now. But this project was an interesting one because we worked with children in schools in one of the most socially and economically deprived areas of Britain, in Wolverhampton. And so these were children who were coming from backgrounds with very low social and cultural capital. And we were particularly interested in whether or not, by providing them with access to powerful personal devices, we could actually help to liberate some of their talents and bring them forward. And I should declare at the outset that I don't subscribe to the notion that people like Prensky promote, that digital natives are all somehow immediately able to exploit digital technologies to support their learning. There's much research evidence that this is not the case. And I'll talk more about that actually in my session after tea, but I don't want you to go away with this idea that I have this naive notion that if you simply give kids technology, somehow miracles happen. If only it were that easy. But against a background that before coming to this conference, I thought long and hard about what I could select from my more decades than I care to think about now of experience in technology-enhanced learning that could possibly have some relevance to a local context here in India. And this particular slide comes from a recent global survey. Unfortunately, it didn't actually include the Indian subcontinent, and I couldn't get data for the Indian subcontinent, but it does include about 70% of the world. And it's the 7th annual wave of this survey research, and it largely comes from industry and from market research. But the thing I really want to point out to you is the change. On the bottom, you've got the figures of ownership for 2012, and in the green, you've got ownership for 2013. And just look at what's happened to smartphone and tablet ownership just in that year. We've really seen a tipping point for those particular kinds of technologies. And there's some interesting evidence as well that this is for the population as a whole, but there are some interesting studies that suggest that these patterns are reflected in the under 16 population. And a very interesting report just came out in the fall in the US, the 0 to 8 research program, that found that in the US now, over 50% of under 8-year-old children have significant experience of using tablet-based technologies. So, and the key thing about tablets and smartphones is the touch screen technology, particularly for young children, which is one of the things that unifies the experience of the two. Now, given the enthusiasm for mobile phones and smartphones in India, I find it hard to imagine that there isn't pretty universal ownership amongst adults, certainly in urban India. In rural India, obviously, it's a different thing. So I think hopefully what I have to say does have some local relevance. The other issue is, and I think this is an interesting idea. I particularly enjoyed the inaugural addresses yesterday. I thought we were set up with a fantastic context by our 3 eminent presenters yesterday morning. And I think there's this really interesting question about what it means to be gifted in a connected world. And we heard the minister say yesterday, the internet has changed everything. Well, for those who have access to it, that's almost certainly true. And what does it mean to be truly gifted? If you're thinking about giftedness and talent in terms of ultimately commercial capital for a nation. And clearly there's been a lot of policy work, particularly in organisations like the OECD, looking at this kind of talent set, this skill set, as an absolute essential to drive prosperity, both for the individual and for the nation in a digital economy. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens now when we get the next set of PISA results published this year from the tests that have been done. They've added to the suite of tests in maths, science and reading a computer-based problem-solving test. And in 2015, they will be adding a collaborative problem-solving test. And it will be really interesting to see what happens to the league positions across the skill set, whether or not the talent in maths and science, which are very traditional measures of talent, are actually correlated with those other forms of talent. Excuse me. So, to distill down the essence, perhaps slightly controversially, of what digital technologies can do to support learners, they're particularly good where they're used to facilitate interaction. They're also particularly powerful when they support productive learning, and I would argue iterative productive learning, which is where the real development of ideas comes when you have some kind of formative interaction which helps you improve what you're doing. And they're also particularly powerful when they're used to provide feedback and to create a play element for a learning environment. So what do those things look like in a one-to-one context? Well, I just want to give you one tiny snippet, a particular task given to a Year 6 class, so the average age was 10. They were actually in a religious school, hence the topic, the martyrdom of St. Stephen, something that you will find perhaps not anywhere other than in a Catholic school, which is where we happen to be for this one. It was a productive task. The children had heard the story and they were asked to produce their own interpretation of that story. The objective, this is part of the literacy curriculum, the objective was to help children develop their understanding of narrative. So it wasn't simply about the content of the story, there was an important skill behind here. And then they were given a free choice of how they wanted to retell the story. And they could use any tools available. They could use their digital device, which had a number of authoring environments on it, from a simple word processor through to an animation, a stop frame animation production program. Or they could have used, if they'd wanted to, they could have used any other traditional media. So just to give you a contrast, what was interesting, some of the children stuck with a very traditional text-based format, but they chose to write it on their smartphone device. And actually, to be fair, these are more like mini tablets. You can see, I think, from the children's hands that these are more like the mini tablets than the little tiny smartphone that they were using. And other children chose to create an illustrated story combining text and images and sometimes animation. And there was definitely a gradient across the traditional ability spectrum of how complex the stories were, but not necessarily which media children chose. But what it did give them was the freedom, and this was an interesting element that came through yesterday, the freedom to actually work in the media in which they felt most comfortable and which they had most interest. It allowed for differentiation of the task. It engendered sustained engagement. Some of these children spent days on this story, something which in a traditional context they would have spent maybe one lesson in class on. Because they were working on their device, they worked in their own time over a period of days. They worked with multiple media for the most part, and it was a highly productive task for them. Another element of the kinds of things that they did were to do with